So I'm here on a Saturday morning about to talk to some investors and property owners about their leases. We talk to landlords like you guys in settings just like this about their leases, because it's not a formality. It's not just some document that you have to sign because everybody does it. Your lease is probably the most important document you sign for the management of your rental property. But too many landlords don't really understand their lease or exactly how to use it. So if you apply these principles, I guarantee you your leasing experience is going to be much better. First is, can you explain the provisions in your lease to a group of fifth graders? If you have difficulty reading through your whole lease and you can't explain exactly what's in it to someone who's 10 or 11 years old, it might be because you don't fully understand your lease. And you may find later that that provision that you never really understood is the thing that's causing you the biggest problems, that's preventing the cash flow that you otherwise would have been able to access, but you can't because you don't know how to enforce that particular portion of your lease. Other things that come up with leases are, does your lease even comport completely with the laws of this state? We're in Texas right now, and so each of you who have rental property in the state of Texas should have a lease that lines up with the laws of the state of Texas. And if you don't know, then you might want to check that out. There are certain provisions in your lease that if they're not bold print or underlined are unenforceable. And if you don't know that requirement, you may show up to court and say, Your Honor, I demand satisfaction. It's right there in black and white. And that same judge may tell you, maybe, but it ain't right. And if you didn't follow the rule, you can't get the benefit. Number 3, do you know who's actually living on your property? And does your lease tell you who's living on the property? Because it's not enough to have a handful of people who came in at move-in day and then you show up for some inspection later on and find a handful of people living there. Because there's a distinct difference when grandma and grandpa sign a lease and you see grandma and grandpa move in, but 6 months later, you see 6 college freshmen living in the same unit. There's a different degree of liability and a different use of the property. And there are different names on that lease than the people who are actually in charge of caring for and maintaining that property. That's a huge red flag that you got to deal with. And your lease should identify properly everybody who's there. And I recommend for minor children, even including their ages, so that it's evident to you at all times. Grandma, grandpa, that's it. If you see 4 adults and 17 children, like, that doesn't match up with the lease. And it should be accurate 100% of the time through the entire tenancy. What about notice? So many times I review leases and the notice provision in your lease is either blank or deficient. We live in an age where communication is so easy. We communicate by text and by cell phone. We have apps. We have all sorts of ways of communicating, yet none of them are featured in our leases for some reason. That section near the end of the lease that talks about notice often is left blank or only has one point of contact. I strongly encourage landlords to have multiple points of contact because I guarantee you, when there's trouble, that one point of contact breaks down and all of a sudden you're coming to me and saying, Ernie, I'm being ghosted by my tenant, because you've only got one method of communication with them. But if you've got 5, I guarantee you it's going to be a lot easier for you to get your point across to them when the time comes. And then finally, what do you do if you're unsure about your lease and its status and its strength and the way that it operates? Well, number 1, you come to things like this and you talk to people who know. You talk to your mentor and ask questions. Is this lease up to snuff? Because if it ain't, you shouldn't be using it. Right? And as soon as you can replace it, as soon as you can modify it, as soon as you can change it, you ought to do that. Also, you can come to, of course, a landlord attorney and find out what makes a rock solid all-star lease, I could definitely help you out, among many other things that I can do to make sure that your landlording experience is tip-top. And so on that, I want to go ahead and open it up. If there's anybody that has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
If their lease says notices can be served via email, is that appropriate?
Some notices can be served by email. If you have a notice of termination, you can serve that by email. If you have a notice of default, that can be served by email. If you have some notice of a change in a payment method, for example, I used to have an account with Chase Bank and now I'm with Bank of America, all those can be served by email. But the Texas Property Code, for Texas evictions specifically, regulates that a notice to vacate is that one very special notice that can only be delivered in accordance with Chapter 24 of the Property Code, and email is not one of those provisions. However, it is an acceptable additional provision as long as you serve that tenant in one proper way. And my recommendation to all landlords, because I've never had this turned away by a single court in the state of Texas, is that you deliver that notice by regular and certified mail. You do them both by regular and certified mail. Throw in email, throw in text, throw in WhatsApp, put a banner in the sky behind a plane with that notice, all of that, smoke signals, sign language, interpretive dance, whatever you got, do that, because I've never seen a landlord turned away by a court for more notice. I've only seen landlords turn away from less notice than is required by the code.
Very good, very helpful. The people that you approved are actually the people that are living there, and all of a sudden it's not. What's the best course of action at that point?
The best course of action is to send a notice of default in the name of the tenant who signed the lease. Now, you may know that Joe and Mary signed the lease, but Frank and Steve and Alan are living there now. Frank, Steve, and Alan didn't sign anything, and so they don't have what the law refers to as privity with you, the landlord, which means you can't sue Frank and Steve and Alan for eviction, and you can't collect rent from them, even if they're the ones writing the checks and have been for the last 60 days. Instead, the original tenants who signed the lease are who you send your notice to, regular and certified mail, and then any other method that you care to employ. But they're the ones who you're going to send the notice to, and they're the ones who are going to get that eviction on their record. What if an occupant is living on a property, they've signed the lease, but a third party is actually paying the monthly rent? Can they be held responsible? Unfortunately, no. Only the person in privity, the person who actually signed, is the one on the hook. The court is not in any way interested in whether or not some other party has paid. You might be interested because the fact is, if the person who signed the lease doesn't have the capacity to pay without the assistance of a third party, that's a red flag that you should take very seriously, because sometimes that well runs dry, and the person who is the most interested in making sure that payment gets made is the person who's living on the property. And if they have little to no capacity to make that payment, you are at risk as the landlord. Would you add a third party to the lease? It is possible to add them as a guarantor. Some leases have this. Again, sometimes that's helpful, but like I mentioned, the person who's staying on the property, if they themselves do not have a financial capacity to pay that bill, they are the ones who have the most to lose from non-payment, right? And so if they lack that capacity and some other party is paying their bill in order to be there, yes, you can secure yourself with a guarantor, but that guarantor then can't be sued for eviction. You could take a higher deposit. There are all sorts of mechanisms that you can employ, but essentially the one you sue is the one who signed. Whether they live there or they don't, the one you sue is the one who signed. If two parties signed a lease and the two original signing parties, they skip town, and the two unauthorized occupants maintain, are they squatters? And the truth of the matter is, no. They are not squatters, because they entered in vicariously through permission that you gave to the two original parties. And so any invitees, any guests, any unauthorized occupants that were let in by someone who was in privity with you is there because of them. So guess what? Who do you sue? The one who signed, right? You sue the one who signed. And so if those two skip town, you send a notice to vacate, they leave, but they left people behind, guess what? They haven't left yet. They're still there because of the people they welcomed onto the property. And so you would go through the same, you would sue the original two, you would take a judgment for unpaid rent, and they would get an eviction on their record as though they had stayed, because they did through the permission they gave to other parties from whom you cannot take a judgment, because those two didn't sign your lease. But the violation is unpaid rent and now unauthorized occupants who they allowed without your permission or consent. What do you do if a genuine squatter, someone who came in with zero permission, essentially broke into property that you own while it was vacant and established residency? Well, that's a key term, the establishment of residency. And that typically happens when we're not paying attention, because it takes more than just being inside of a property to establish residency. Here's what I tell landlords all the time. If you've got vacant property, there's a few things you can do. Number one, get your neighbors, deputize them. You know, let them know, hey, I'm here, I've got property. It's gonna take me 3 months to do anything with it. Can you keep an eye out? I don't currently have tenants, so no one should be here. The moment anybody's here, give me a call if you could. Appreciate it, thanks. Here's a gift card to Chili's. The other thing is, you might want to set up a ring cam. A doorbell camera is your best friend, and it will let you know the moment somebody has crossed that threshold, and you call the cops, say someone's in there that don't belong, and I want them out, so that they never have the opportunity to establish a residency on the property. Next, you got to be there all the time. You have to be diligent with your property, know what's happening on it, and who's there at all times. The squatters who take advantage tend to take advantage of houses that remain vacant for extended periods of time without adequate supervision. Landlords and property investors who are on it don't have that problem. They just don't.
Hey, my tenant wants to do a 2-year lease. What's your perspective on leases beyond 12 months?
So I also like a 12-month lease, because you get to make changes after those 12 months when the market changes. So there's a number of people who signed 2- and 3-year leases way back when, and now that rates are going through the roof, they're thinking, I could be making so much money. And then the problem is, if I jump to market rate, I'm gonna lose a really good tenant. What do I do? By giving yourself that huge lease, you're actually tying your hands and preventing yourself and your tenant from establishing a healthy, long-term relationship. The 12-month lease is good because you can incrementally rise with the market, and you can keep a good tenant without shocking them into a market rate. But if your tenant insists on that, and for whatever reason you see it as a good investment, it should be based on a cost that is slightly above the market, to take into consideration the 5, potentially 10% rise in the market rate that you're going to miss out on due to locking in the rate for 24 or more months.
Could you build in bumps at a certain date?
You could. Commercial leases do this all the time. So commercial leases might be a 10-year lease with bumps every year or every 2 years. Residential leases can do the same, but it has to be clearly indicated in the lease in order for it to be enforceable. And I would, in black and white, put whatever that step up is as it comes due, so that it is absolutely clear that the rent will change over time. If someone simply just wants to lock in their tenancy and don't mind a rate increase after 12 months, then that's another way that you can accommodate potential.
There's really no duration that's prohibited?
No, I've seen tenants stay for 10 plus years, and as long as the written agreement is absolutely clear, as long as it is clear that this is a tenancy and not the purchase of property, you are protected, which is why it's good to have a rock solid lease in place, as opposed to anything that implies ownership interest or purchase. If you have the word purchase or option to buy in your lease and don't know what it means and don't know how to use it properly, you open the door for problems of a claim of ownership. But as long as you don't have those things, and I recommend you don't, as long as you don't have those things in a lease, you establish very clearly that the contract relationship between you, the landlord, and them, the tenant, is precise. They are leasing the property for a given term, and they are in no way purchasing and in no way gathering ownership interest.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, guys. To all the vendors, round of applause.